Welcome to Green Box Politics. I am your host, Red Stick Mirage, also known as Blackbeard Mirage. And just want to thank the ladies and gentlemen for tuning in. This Green Box Politics episode 1 will be covering Mr. Leroy Nicholas Barnes, also known as Nicky Barnes. All right. So in this episode, we will be talking about Leroy Nicholas Barnes, also known as Nicky Barnes. And in Green Box Politics, this series, we will evaluate and analyze American street culture and American street history. And we also will analyze the street mentality, the street behavior, and other aspects of the streets. So the objective of these videos is both for educational and entertainment purposes. We want to learn some of the background into, why the circumstances are the way they are in the so-called black community, and just get an understanding of it. All right. So no matter what your age is and no matter what your ethnic national background is, I'm sure we all can learn something from this. So tuned in, and I'm glad to have you here. All right. So how this will go is we will give a, basic introduction to who our subject of the video will be. And then we will go through a little bit of their life story. And then we will go deeper into the esoteric side of their story to try to highlight and catch some of the things that maybe these other documentaries and blogs, podcasts, and other mediums where we've seen, stories or information about these men, but try to highlight some things that maybe aren't talked about as much. OK. As we can also have to recall, or basically as we have to make this statement, a lot of these events, we may have not been there. So we do our best to investigate what may have happened, and we put that information out. So this is not to, bring any negativity to the family members and friends of those involved in these situations, because people have lost their lives. People have become drug addicts. People have gotten life sentences. So this is a very, very serious topic. So we want to, treat it with respect and keep it as real as we can. OK. So the first thing is that Mr. Nicholas Barnes, or Nicky Barnes, he was born on October 15th of 1933. OK. And through some of my background check, they say that his parents more than likely were part of that great migration out of the South going into the North. All right. So his parents could have been from somewhere in the South, but he eventually moved to New York, and that's where he grew up. You also have to remember that a lot of communities, in New York where so-called black Americans live, they were very, very impoverished. So Nicky Barnes, he did have a hard life growing up. Probably didn't have as much resources. His parents had to work, because they say that his father was an alcoholic and he was abusive towards his mother. OK, this is Nicky Barnes' father, that he was an alcoholic and he was abusive towards his mother. And this was the type of situation that Nicky Barnes was growing up in his household. So you can only imagine, the trauma and stress that put him through as a young man. And, it got to a point where it said that, one night his father was in his drunken spell and he was attempting to beat his mother. And Nicky pulled out a small gun and attempted to shoot his father. And, after he attempted to shoot his father, he basically ran away from home and went into the streets. OK. So like a lot of situations, when the home life is pretty tough, it will lead a lot of the youth into the streets, and you start to look into the streets. And sometimes when you don't want to be in that environment, you will become homeless. So that's, a situation that Nicky Barnes found himself in his teenage years. OK, so he went into the streets. And we got to remember, too, the year he was born. He was born in 1933. So a lot of you all, he was in that generation of your grandparents. OK. My grandmother was born in 1924, so he wasn't born too much later after her. So Nicky Barnes wasn't, he was a real elder, like he was much older, as we'll see, especially when he started getting into his drug selling and created his drug empire. So when Nicky got in the streets, we got to look at maybe some of the drugs that were going on in his time period. So if he was born in 1933, that means in the 50s, that's when he was in his 20s. OK. And then in the 60s, that's when he was in his 30s. So we can kind of track like what was going on during his time period. And as he was growing up, the methadone, morphine, heroin, a little bit of the cocaine, this is what was going on in the community and going on in the streets. So Nicky, being, you know, a young man in the streets, he got into the heroin, and he actually got into using heroin. So Nicky was he was a man that was using heroin. So, you know, for all of us that may have grown up during the 90s, I can remember a lot of BG from Cash Money from New Orleans. You know, a lot of BG, he would talk about the murder rap and the murder gang, but he also talked about the usage of heroin and how a lot of the men in Louisiana, they would get into the street crimes and certain street activity, but the heroin use was included in that. So the first thing I want you to understand historically is that the heroin and the black community have a relationship. And it's been like that for quite a while, going back to, you know, the times of our grandparents and even our great-grandparents, okay? So Nicky Barnes actually was addicted to heroin from the ages of about 19 to 26 years old, all right? So, you know, understand also that heroin was marketed as like this cool, creative drug to so-called black people as well. So a lot of black entertainers that were, you know, musicians, etc., during the time of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when they were going to their creative zone, the heroin was used to, I guess you can say, inspire and fuel their creativity. All right. People like, you know, Billie Holiday and other singers and musicians and jazz players, etc. They were very, very talented and great performers, but a lot of them were introduced to the heroin as well. So Nicky Barnes, he basically was part of that same phenomenon with our people. So in the early 50s, you know, Nicky Barnes started to get in a lot of trouble, and a lot of his charges that he would get were basically like, you know, user charges. So in 1952 and 1954, he had a possession of methadone charge. In 1955, he had a misdemeanor possession of heroin charge. And in 1956, 1957, and 1959, he was arrested for possession of heroin. Okay, so as we can see, from about 1952 to the 1959, about a whole decade, when Nicky Barnes was in his teenage years and, you know, going into his young manhood, he was associated and around a lot of the heroin, and he had a bad heroin problem. Okay, so he was a heroin addict, and it got to a point where he was sentenced to about 2 to 5 years in the late 50s from, you know, his various drug charges. And I also want you to remember, too, that the way the criminal justice system is today, those brothers that was growing up back during Nicky Barnes' time, you may have gotten caught with certain drugs, heroin, and even certain, you know, murder charges, robbery, but these guys weren't getting life sentences. So they would be in there, you know, a short period of time and they would get out. Those harsh sentences didn't come till much later, after a lot of the destruction that these, you know, men ended up creating. So that's why once it got to the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and particularly the 90s, that's when now you got these, you know, lengthy sentences from being caught with cocaine and heroin and things of that nature. You know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, life sentences, life without parole for being caught with drugs and committing certain murders. But Nicky Barnes was a little bit before that. So he didn't even do a decade in prison, you know, during the, you know, early 60s, late 50s. He was only in there for a couple of years, all right? While he was in prison, of course, he went through withdrawal, okay? Withdrawal is basically when you are addicted to drugs, and when you can't use these drugs anymore, the human body goes through this process where it needs the drug. It's dependent on it. So part of the withdrawal symptoms that you experience, of course, are the cold, you know, the hot flashes, the sweating, diarrhea, etc. It's a very, very painful process, and it's probably even more painful to go through it in prison when you're locked up. So this is something that Nicky Barnes experienced, and, you know, and when you're in prison also, they make you go through it cold turkey, meaning that you just, you off of it, you know. So if you get arrested, that means that from that point forward, when you're in prison, you're not using the drug anymore. So you didn't get to slowly wean yourself off of it. And that could be very, very abusive to the human brain and also the physical body. I can remember Gucci Mane talking about some of the withdrawal he went through when he was in prison, because what we know of as lean or the codeine, that is a form of liquid heroin, okay? So the heroin is still around today, believe it or not. It's just in a different form, all right? And it's also mixed in with other drugs. So Nicky Barnes, he went through that withdrawal in prison, and eventually he got himself cleansed, and he was released around 1962 when he was about 29, 30 years old, late 20s, early 30s when he was released. So, once you get in your late 20s and early 30s, that's when your mind starts to get a little bit stronger. Some of them immature decisions you used to make, you can start to see past that. The human brain doesn't really start to develop, especially for a young man, until he's in his mid 20s. So from about, let's say, your mid to late 20s, when you're younger than that, like let's say 20, 25 on down, that's when a lot of poor decisions are made. Okay. And Nicky Barnes was no different. So when he was in, after he got out of prison, he started to make these connections with Italian and French mobsters and Italian and French drug lords who started to help him get access to heroin. And they also taught him how to organize himself and move like more of a professional corporate businessman. Okay. This is something that a lot of so-called black men, in particular in New York, when they were dealing with these older, mob bosses that were, Italian, Corsican, etc., these men were much older. So, Nicky Barnes may have been, let's say, in his late 20s, early 30s, but a lot of these mobsters from these other ethnic national groups he was dealing with in New York that were giving him the drugs, these guys were already in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So they already knew how to move. And you also got to remember, too, that a lot of these Caucasian mobsters, although they did, it wasn't like they were moving in silence, because they had the drive-bys and, and the shootouts and shooting up buildings, and, it's a restaurant and it's one man you want to get, but you just wet up the whole restaurant. They were doing that, too. So it's not like so-called black men created the drive-by and some of that, wild, erratic behavior when it comes to these shootouts. It was actually these Caucasian criminal organizations, that were going back to like the 20s and 30s and stuff like that. So this is, who Nicky Barnes was schooled and taught by. He saw how they were organized, and he took that same structure, and created his own empire from that, which we later on would know to be the council. Okay. I also want you to remember that during the 1970s, that, Harlem, New York was the black drug addict capital. Okay. They were saying basically that probably half of the people in Harlem were addicted to the heroin. All right. Or were using it. All right. So just want you to think about how pervasive it was in the community. I also want you to note on that, once the drugs start to come in, a lot of the violence, the corruption, it increases. All right. And these Caucasian politicians in New York, these Caucasian police force, they preferred these conditions in the so-called black community. Another thing I want you to understand, too, is that when it came to that French connection and the Italian drug lords that Nicky Barnes was in business with, they stated out of their own mouths that they preferred the drugs, the heroin, the crime to be in the so-called black communities. So they didn't want to sell the drugs and have people addicted to that in their own Italian communities. They would go over and deal with these so-called black men from Harlem and sell the drugs to them, and then they would sell those drugs to people in their own communities. So that's something you got to think about as well. But, the so-called black community conditions were so desolate, destroyed, even by this time period, by the 70s, that Nicky Barnes and a lot of those other brothers, even before Nicky Barnes, like you guys like Bumpy Johnson, it was a lot of poor ethics involved in that. So yes, you may have had brothers like Malcolm X that influenced these men, and Malcolm X was preaching during this time and telling them to put the drugs down, because Malcolm X had come from the streets. Malcolm X had come from pimping and, probably drug selling and drug usage himself, but he had cleansed himself of that. So Malcolm X was a symbol to a lot of these men, including Nicky Barnes. But, when you face with surviving or ethics, a lot of the times surviving will win. And you're going to see that as a repeated theme throughout these Green Box Politics episodes, that you may have these moral codes and principles that you stand on. And when the conditions and the pressure isn't as hard, it's easier to stand on them. But once that pressure cooker starts to hit and things get tough, you're now challenged with individual survival and upholding, let's say, morality and principles and ethics. And I would say 8 to 9 times out of 10, the individual is going to choose survival. More than likely 9 times out of 10, damn near 9.5 times out of 10, the individual is going to choose survival if they have some kind of an outlet. All right. So now you have, Nicky Barnes and his Council 7, which were a group of men that he was doing business with. And they had a motto, which was to treat my brother as I treat myself. And this is what, kept them tight. You know what I'm saying? Kept them organized and kept every man, with some type of integrity. And you can see that even during Nicky Barnes's time, that street mentality and, that street code, it even existed during his time. And he was born in 1933. So that's nothing new. If people get mad about, oh, Gunner, you a snitch, or oh, 6ix9ine, you a snitch. Even though 6ix9ine isn't an Aboriginal American, but that street culture of not snitching, it even goes back way back before Gunner and 6ix9ine. It even goes back probably a little bit before Nicky Barnes. Okay. So you got the Council 7 and, they're all doing business. Everything is good. Nicky Barnes is looked at as this like status symbol for a lot of the young baby boomers. So, for example, like my father was born in 1949. OK, so that means that when my father was growing up in the 70s, people that were his age, that may have been in their, let's say, teens, 20s and 30s during the 70s. Just like today, how we get inspired from the so-called rappers and they have the gold chains, all the women, the money, the cars. If you was a young so-called black man that was in your teens, your 20s or your 30s during the 70s, when they had a lot of the black exploitation films coming out, you could see a lot of the NBA players like Walt Frazier and Wilt Chamberlain with the nice jackets, the fur coats, the nice cars with the diamond in the back, all the women. If you was a young brother growing up in poverty, these guys were like mythological figures to you. And Nicky Barnes was no different. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of the baby boomer men that were in the streets that was being influenced by that, era, this is what they were growing up in. OK, and that's very, very important to know. So you'll understand the streets of so-called Black America today and like kind of why things were the way they were. And of course, Nicky Barnes, his organization was making millions of dollars per year. And they would also create these clever marketing schemes, to promote their drugs. So, for example, they would have heroin, but with the heroin, they would step on it. And when you step on the heroin or any type of drug, you take that pure drug and you mix it with some type of a substance that's going to make it weaker. All right. So although you may have a whole, let's say, kilo of cocaine or a whole kilo of heroin, but when you bust that down into these little packages, you're not putting 100% heroin in there. You're going to cut it. So you're going to have, let's say, maybe 2% or 5% or whatever heroin. And then the rest of it is cut with some other type of additive. So what they would do is Nicky Barnes and, his crew, they would put these packs out. And let's say the first pack may have been named, Astro Space. I'm just making something up. And then on the front of the package, they may have had a picture of a man in an astronaut suit or something like that, right? And that heroin package may have been, let's say, 4% or 6% or, 7% heroin. Now, that's very, very strong and very, very potent because the type of heroin that they were getting back then, it was much stronger than this stuff that they got out there today. And it wasn't cut as much. So that means that when people were taking this stuff in the streets, they were overdosing. A lot of people were dying. But that would also raise the marketing of that product. So now you have people taking this pack, you know what I'm saying? And then people overdosing and now they, hearing about it and other people saying, damn, man, you heard about Nicky, them new pack, that Astro Space? Like, man, old Joe over there, man, he just OD'd off of it, X, Y, and Z. So now that's making people want to go and try it, So it get people more hooked. And then, of course, other packs they put out, they may not be as strong. They may, decrease the dosage down to about maybe 2% or 3% or 4%. And then now, but you've already marketed and got everybody, looking for the new package. So this is a strategy that they were using. And Nicky Barnes wasn't the only one. All right. This is a strategy they were using. So, marketing, you know what I'm saying? It was marketing. Another thing, too, that, Nicky Barnes, they would get in trouble by getting caught with certain packages or certain things that, they were doing to get in trouble in the county, New York County, New York State. They were trying to build cases on this man. But, you got to remember these street guys, they have a lot of money so they can get these powerful attorneys and these powerful defense teams. And Nicky Barnes, he had an attorney by the name of David Breitbart, and this guy was a genius, and he was able to find a lot of loopholes to get Nicky Barnes out of trouble because, you know, the way the law works, you have to be proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. So they were always able to find some type of a reasonable doubt, and it would get, you know, the client off. And Nicky Barnes is no different. And what will happen is that, you know, when you getting away with these crimes, the ego starts to get inflated, and you start to think that you can't be touched and you can't be caught. And of course, you know, eventually he caught the attention of the president, which was Jimmy Carter at that time. And now we will, because this is right here on the screen, what you see in front of you is basic Wikipedia information, but we're just using this as the backdrop to go deeper into what we're talking about. So now we're going to zoom down. And we're going to talk about his arrest and conviction. Now, this is what really got Nicky Barnes in trouble, okay? On June 5th, 1977, the New York Times Magazine released an article titled, quote, "Mr. Untouchable," end quote, featuring Barnes posing on the front cover. The magazine told Barnes that they were going to use a mugshot of Barnes unless he posed for cameras. Barnes, who hated mugshots, agreed and took the shot. Barnes's posture of smug invulnerability so affronted President Jimmy Carter that the president ordered the United States Attorney General Griffin Bell to prosecute Barnes to the fullest extent of the law. The Justice Department prosecuted Barnes for his drug-related crimes, and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on January 19th, 1978. The chief prosecutor in the case was Robert B. Fisk, then the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. So the New York Times Magazine, you know, which is very, very peculiar to me, decided to put Nicky Barnes on their cover. And him and his ego, you know, him and his Luciferianism and not being caught, because at this time he never really had a federal case against the federal government. He was beating a lot of the things in, you know, the New York County, like local officials in New York, local police, and some of these state New York charges. He was able to beat that. But now when this article comes out, he catches the attention of the United States president, okay, which was Jimmy Carter at that time. And we have to understand, too, that the federal government has more resources than, let's say, a state or a local government. So that means that their investigations can go much longer than, let's say, a state or a county or a local investigation. So a local investigation or a local police, they may have only X amount of resources. So they'll investigate for that amount of time. And during that time period, they have to get as much evidence as they can, get a search warrant signed by a judge, you know, perform the search warrant, get evidence, lock up who they think the offender is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas with the federal government, they have more resources, so they can take a longer time to build their case, meaning that they're not going to strike until they got everything they need. Okay, so now this is where Nicky Barnes finds himself dealing with a real situation. And on 1978, he was actually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So in 1978, he was sentenced and basically was supposed to die in prison. So now we're going to see where it goes for a turn a little bit. According to Barnes, while in prison, he maintained that his assets were not maintained, and the council had stopped paying his attorney fees. Barnes discovered that one of his fellow council members, Guy Fisher, was having an affair with Barnes's mistress. The council had a rule that no council member would sleep with another council member's wife or mistress. So in response, Barnes decided to become a federal informant. He forwarded a list of 109 names, 5 of them council members, along with his wife's name, implicating them all in illegal activities related to the heroin trade. Barnes helped to indict 44 other traffickers, 16 of whom were ultimately convicted. In his testimony, he implicated himself in 8 murders. While in prison, he also won a national poetry contest for federal inmates, earned a college diploma with honors, and taught fellow inmates English. So ultimately what happened is that those council members that Nicky Barnes was in affiliation with, when Nicky Barnes got cracked in 1978, from what it looks like to me, it looks like he took his charge. It looks like he accepted that, okay, they got me. I'm the ringleader of the heroin crew. I got life in prison without parole. But the council members are still on the outside. I still got my operations and connections, and I can still run the business from in here. So it looks like Nicky Barnes just took, you know what I'm saying? He accepted that he got caught. And initially, Nicky Barnes did not tell on anybody in his crew, or he did not become a federal informant. But once he found out about, people sleeping with his wife and his mistresses, not paying his lawyer fees, a lot of his assets started to be lost. The business started to get fucked up. People started to get sloppy on the outside. And this is what, frustrated Nicky Barnes and said, well, if y'all gonna slime me out, then I'm gonna slime y'all out. So this is ultimately what happened. All right. So it says here that he forwarded a list of 109 names. 5 of them were council members. Remember, it was only 7 on the council, and he was one of them. He also told on his wife, because his wife was basically, she cheated on him. Some of his mistresses cheated on him. And, this was, it helped get 44 people indicted, and 16 ultimately were convicted. All right. So this is some of, the history and the background of what happened with Nicky Barnes. And of course, we know about Guy Fisher, because Guy Fisher is the man who, they said was sleeping with his wife. So, ultimately what happened was that after he, helped the federal government, Rudy Giuliani, who at that time was, building his career, and he used a lot of the Nicky Barnes to build and prop himself up. But he was, basically speaking on behalf of Nicky Barnes that he should get his sentence reduced. And ultimately what happened is he was sent to a lower security prison, and he was resentenced to 35 years. Okay. So it says that after Barnes cooperated with the government by working as an informant, Rudy Giuliani sought a reversal of Barnes's life sentence. Eventually, Barnes was resentenced to 35 years. By working in jail, he earned 2 months off of his sentence for every one he served, and was released in August of 1998. So a man that was supposed to get a life sentence eventually was released in 1998 through him cooperating with the federal government. And when he was released, he went into the witness protection program. Okay. Now, the next thing we want to do is I want to give you a little bit more background on Nicky Barnes' situation, because it's very, very easy to say that, Nicky Barnes is a rat, Nicky Barnes is a snitch, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion and their own perspective. But what I want you to, look at is how these council members were sloppy and they were disloyal. And they actually turned Nicky to slime them out because they were sliming Nicky out. All right. And I also want you to look at how we're going to find out that Guy Fisher's brother was caught and he became a federal informant before Nicky Barnes did. All right. So what I'm about to read right now is some information coming off of a podcast. It's from a website, podcast.library.columbia.edu. And different people were given, some information. So let's look at what they have, because we'll learn a lot from this. Heroin is one of the most addictive drugs. It's an opiate or painkiller. It brings on a rush of pleasure and relaxation by flooding the brain with dopamine. And once a user is hooked, withdrawal feels like hell, which starts with a vicious cycle. Heroin has been around since 1874. It used to be the miracle drug, quote, for everything from migraines to cramps, and you could get it over the counter. Over time, people got worried about the drug's long-term effects. And so in the 1970s, the United States made it illegal. But heroin never really went away. It just went underground. So as it says right here, that heroin has been around in the United States since 1874. And it was actually once used as a drug to help with certain, ailments such as migraines and cramps, and you can get it over the counter. But in the 20s, it was made illegal. All right. The so-called heroin epidemic took hold of the United States in the late 60s and early 70s. All right. Federal estimates say that between 1969 and 1974, the number of heroin addicts nationwide more than doubled to over 500,000. There were an average of 70 drug-related deaths per month in New York City in 1971. that was also the year President Nixon declared the war on drugs. So this was that first war on drugs by Nixon in the 70s. Now, we already can see that Nicky Barnes, when he got out, he was right in time for all this. You know what I'm saying? And that's how he was able to create, such a powerful empire from it. But Nixon's war had ulterior motives, allegedly. One Nixon aide later said that the White House, quote, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, end quote. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. New York brought in new mandatory minimums for drug dealing. So this came in like the 70s. So as we can see that the president and the United States government, viewed the so-called black community as an enemy. Now, the black community hadn't necessarily done anything to the United States government, but they know who so-called black people are. They are the sons and daughters or the descendants of the Aboriginal American. So initially, this is their country. So you always have to keep so-called black Americans in some type of a lower state. And during the 70s, they chose to use heroin as that. So that's why in a lot of the black exploitation films and a lot of the black entertainers of that time, you saw them associate with the heroin because they wanted the masses of so-called black Americans to take that on as a new drug to use. All right. Now, listen to this. This is very important. It says when Guy Fisher joined the council, Nicky was almost 40 years old. Guy was 23. Guy would later write of meeting Nicky, quote, he had everything, I had nothing, end quote. So as we can see that Guy Fisher was much younger than Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes was almost 40 years old and Guy Fisher was 23. And Guy Fisher also stated, quote, that Nicky had everything and he had nothing. So Guy Fisher actually got put on by Nicky Barnes. Guy Fisher was Nicky Barnes' like protege. Okay. This is very, very important for you to remember. So you can kind of see how Guy Fisher, if he didn't have the right mindset or if he had envy in him, he could become jealous of Nicky Barnes because Nicky was looked at as the man. Nicky was looked at as the one who's the leader. You know what I'm saying? So if he didn't look at Nicky like, as like an older brother or the OG or the elder that put him on and just accepted his role, then Guy Fisher would start to become jealous. All right. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened because I wasn't there. But once again, we're talking about street mentality and street behavior. OK. So now we want to move on. We already know about, once again, when you're selling drugs, all the money is coming in. Everything is good. So that's when they had that treat my brother as I treat myself. Everything's going good. Everybody's getting money. Nicky Barnes is looked at as the Robin Hood of the neighborhood. And so is Guy Fisher, because these guys would do these turkey drives, buy children sneakers, buy out the ice cream truck, etc. So, that thing where, and the reason why so-called black men do this is because you subconsciously know you're destroying the community with the drug selling, the killings, the murders, etc. So as a way to kind of relieve some of that guilt, they'll take a couple of shekels and, go buy some toys and bikes during Christmas or some turkeys during Thanksgiving, like you saw Nino Brown do in New Jack City. But these same people you giving the food to are the same people you selling this drug to and destroying. So that's nothing new either. So what we want to get to now is about Guy Fisher's brother. Okay. Right here, here's a picture of the New York Times Magazine, issue. It was June 5th, 1977. Most of us have seen this before. This is what got Nicky Barnes in trouble. All right. Now, this is the part we want to get at. It says the DEA went to work. Remember, it said that after, Jimmy Carter saw this, they started to put their eyes on Nicky Barnes now. It says the DEA went to work. They sent undercover agents to infiltrate the council, and they did it through Guy Fisher's younger brother, Wally. Remember, Wally, he was the youngest of Guy's 4 siblings. While Guy was in prison, Wally spilled the beans on the council. Let me reread that. It says the DEA went to work. They sent undercover agents to infiltrate the council, and they did it through Guy Fisher's younger brother, Wally. Wally, he was the youngest of Guy Fisher's 4 siblings. While Guy was in prison, Wally spilled the beans on the council. And Wally was this wannabe gangster. This is what somebody else wrote. This is not me saying it. He was 19 or 20 years old. He was not a player at all in the organization. So what we see right here is that the DEA got Guy Fisher's brother to flip. He was turned into an informant. And this is also, what helped infiltrate the council. So it's like I said, it wasn't like Nicky Barnes, during his time when he was out selling drugs and the little times when he was getting caught and the government, or not the government, but New York City was trying to scare him. He didn't give no information up. You know what I'm saying? Because he was getting off of all those charges. But once Nicky Barnes got sentenced to life and he went in prison, his crew on the outside started to get sloppy. They started to sleep with his women. This is when he decided to flip. But what if Guy Fisher's brother already had infiltrated the council and already was giving up information? You see? And it says here that, Guy Fisher's younger brother was like a wannabe gangster. And we see that a lot, especially in the streets. You may have that one person who really is about that. He really is about the murder or the money or whatever it is he's into in the streets. He either may have that friend or a brother or somebody associated with him that may like the glamour of the street life, but they not really part of that. You know what I'm saying? They not really willing to go out there and take those risks. They somebody more on the outside looking in, but because they got somebody, closely affiliated with them in the streets, by default, they going to get that same rep, that same clout. And that's what Guy Fisher's brother was like, because in this same documentation, it says that, and I'll read it right here. It says, and in a way, we, the federal government, were very fortunate that Guy Fisher had gotten arrested and gone to prison, because his kid brother, Guy Fisher, would not have allowed his brother to get involved with Robert Geronimo, who was one of the informants, or the undercover agent, Luis Diaz. He just was too smart. So what happened was that, Guy Fisher's brother, not being experienced, not understanding street behavior and behavior analysis, you had these agents that were undercover being sent to Guy Fisher's brother and setting up these business deals. And then eventually when Guy Fisher's brother got caught, they said, look, if you don't give us X, Y, and Z, give us information, you going down for life, or you going down for this, or you going down for that. So in that fear, Guy Fisher's brother turned into an informant against the council. But while all this was going on, Guy Fisher was in jail. So you just got to remember that, these guys be in and out in jail until they finally get caught and they get that, that final conviction, either by the federal government or the state. And, while this was happening, Guy Fisher's brother was still out, So this is what led to the council getting infiltrated. Guy Fisher's brother out trying to do business with men who really were undercover agents. And had his brother known, he wouldn't have allowed him to do that. Okay. This is why if you're not really involved in the streets, you know what I'm saying, and you really ain't supposed to be out there, and you're not willing to deal with all the consequences, you should stay far away from it. So it says that Wally's mistake, remember, Wally is Guy Fisher's younger brother. Wally's mistakes ended up being the most crucial evidence that incriminated the council. On March 16th, 1977, agents arrested Nicky and the rest of the council, including Guy. He'd done his 18 months for trying to bribe those cops. So he was out of prison and back at work selling drugs, and now on trial. So it says that Wally's mistakes ended up bringing the most crucial evidence that incriminated the council. Remember, Nicky didn't get in trouble until January of 1978. That's when he was convicted and found guilty and sent to, life in prison without parole. But in the prior year, in 1977, in that spring, Wally, Guy Fisher's younger brother, he had gotten caught. You know what I'm saying? Or excuse me, that prior year in 1977, when Nicky and the rest of the council got arrested, the reason why they got arrested is because all that information that Wally had given them and him being an undercover informant, this is what gave, the government and the state everything they needed to lock up the council. So they were arrested in 1977 in March 16th, but he was fully convicted in January of 1978. So that meant that Wally had gotten caught before March of 1977. All right. Nicky Barnes didn't become a federal informant until sometime in 78. So really, who was the rat first? It was Wally. It was Guy Fisher's younger brother. And then also you got to look at Guy Fisher and the council. These guys were disloyal to Nicky Barnes. Remember, this is nothing you're going to learn in this. There really is no principles and ethics in the streets. It's only principles and ethics in the streets when everybody's getting money, when all the women are there, you know what I'm saying, and everything is going good and there's no problems. That's when the ethics and the principles are at their strongest. But once people start getting pinched, people start getting trouble, these life sentences start getting brought down, and the federal government or the state, they start, threatening these guys. Now you get to really see who is about principle and who is about survival. And majority of the time, what you're going to see is that whoever is the CEO of the empire, the one that's the mastermind, the one that has all the plugs and connects, the one that, probably had the millions of dollars and may have money still tucked away or hidden, they're typically going to be the ones that say, look, I can't do life. So they're going to turn informant. And the guy who is the shooter or the people that's just part of the crew, the enforcers, the hitmen, the assassins, see, a lot of the times those guys really aren't that smart. They aren't intellectual. They don't know how to socialize on a business level. They don't know how to network and organize men. They just good for doing the muscle. They just good for, committing murder. So they have to stand on principle. And that would be an example of somebody like Pappy Mason and Wayne Perry. Pappy Mason, in his situation, he was the, kind of the muscle for Fat Cat Nichols. And then Wayne Perry, he was the muscle for my boy Alpo. All right. And in the future, they'll have their own episode. But to conclude this, what we want to see is that, Nicky Barnes, eventually he died in 2012, but I don't think the public knew about it until 2019. So, also too, they used the RICO to take down the council in Nicky Barnes. So the same way that they're using the RICO today to take down Young Thug and Sex Money Murder and the YSL, the same way they're using the RICO to take down Wyatt Finn and Lucci, the same way they used the RICO to take down the 9 Trey Bloods in New York and 6ix9ine and Shotty in them, is the same way they used the RICO to take down the council and Nicky Barnes. And they also used that RICO to take down some of those Italian mobsters from their French connection before them. So the RICO is how the federal government and the state government are going to get these organized groups when they can't fully pinpoint everything. All right. They're going to just get you by that association. So, y'all tell me in the comment section what you think. Do you still see Nicky Barnes as just this rat? Or were the council members disloyal? And another thing, was Guy Fisher sleeping with Nicky Barnes' women when Nicky Barnes was out? I highly doubt it. Were they fooling around with the business and getting sloppy when Nicky Barnes was out? I highly doubt it. So what happened is that when Nicky Barnes went into prison and they knew he had life without the possibility of parole, this allowed them to decide, do we want to still be loyal to him or do we want to start sliming Nicky out? And that's what they did. They started sliming Nicky out. Also, that Nicky Barnes and his councilmen, they had invested into the Apollo Theater. And Nicky Barnes stated that one of his associates told him while he was in prison that, that Guy Fisher is kissing up on your woman. I saw them in a booth at the Apollo Theater. And this is what set Nicky Barnes off. So that's another thing you're going to see in a lot of these street stories, that women typically have something to do with these empires falling. That's why I'm a firm believer that women shouldn't be involved nowhere in the streets, but by default they are. So if you in the streets, you better watch all the women around you, because 7 times out of 10, they're going to have something to do with the whole empire falling. Even if somebody get the ratting and telling and snitching. Remember, Nicky Barnes didn't start telling until he found out they were sleeping with his woman. All before that, he kept it real. He stood on 10. So y'all tell me what you think. Green Box Politics, episode 1. We out.